Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 50. I have Tim Virkkala, who was the assistant, let's just say he was the number 2 person at Liberty Magazine for about 12 years. He wore a lot of hats there, but he was the guy in charge when Bill Bradford wasn't in charge, which means he did most of the work. So he certainly helped make Liberty Magazine what it was, and he's been a longtime libertarian with many different influences, and he's also probably one of the smartest guys I've ever worked with. So how are you, Tim?
I'm okay. I feel good tonight, and I should have cracked open some whiskey, but I have Diet Coke instead. Sorry.
Yes, or you could get Diet Safeway Select too, but anyway.
Oh, yeah.
The only Diet Cola that I found actually remotely drinkable, but anyway.
I'll give it a try.
Only available at Safeway, of course, but yes. So anyway, we just got the news 2 days ago about Tucker Carlson being out at Fox. What do you make of all this?
Well, it was one of those surprises that aren't surprises, right? I mean, you knew it was going to happen sometime, but you just never expect it today or tomorrow or the next, the day after. It's always a shock. Especially, it was a shock to him, I think, in the sense that he didn't know it was coming on that day. That's what it seems pretty clear as. But he also could see the writing on the wall, right? And so that's not a real shock. It's hard to get rid of your most important person, but sometimes you gotta. And if you're a part of establishment media, how long are you going to keep Tucker on your show? I mean, the head of what's the guy's name? The owner of
Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch. He is part of the establishment. I mean, he's not.
Oh, yes.
He's not. He's not a populist. And Tucker has been straying from the old Republican line of you might say supply side neocondom. Right. That's something that the Republican line was, supply side economics in a kind of fudged way. Right. It was not coherent. And then, of course, neocon.
I wonder, I bet O'Reilly would be cheering for America to get involved with this war in Ukraine. And Tucker wasn't. And maybe that was his offense, it seems.
Right. But since the news, we've learned that Fox has been leaking a whole bunch of dirt about Tucker, especially about the C word used by him of somebody else at Fox News, a woman, and so forth. So it's getting nasty, and they're trying to do unto Tucker what was kind of obvious with Bill O'Reilly. Bill O'Reilly had sexual harassment issues. He was a handsy kind of guy, is what I gathered, and very blunt and not very nice about it. Tucker doesn't appear to be like that, but he did call women the C word. I bet he called men the C word as well. That would be my guess.
Well, he probably, and if he's using that C word with regard to, creatures like Rachel Maddow or Gretchen Whitmer, I can't necessarily blame him, but I don't know.
It was the superior at Fox. There's a woman who was a superior at Fox, sort of the mouthpiece.
I don't know what O'Reilly's family situation was, but I had a feeling that if O'Reilly wanted some action, he probably could have gotten it. I mean, he was a powerful man on TV. He wasn't a bad looking guy, even as he got older. And what's funny though is you get this and said, so Fox News is firing O'Reilly because of screaming and shouting from people who never watch Fox News anyway. I mean, the people who watch Fox News don't care about sexual harassment.
That's true, but management and litigators and lawyers care about it, and therefore the owners would to some degree. And but Tucker was not fired for sexual harassment reasons. That's pretty.
It's rather interesting. I've heard Tucker was occasionally hanging out around in Ron Paul circles. Maybe when Ron Paul was running, I've heard that. I don't know how much proof there is that he was, but.
Well, Tucker always considered himself a libertarian conservative.
Yeah.
And he was a supporter of the Iraq War, but at some point that dissolved, which was convenient about the time it dissolved for nearly everybody in America. And Ron Paul was right there to being somewhat of an influence on his life. But I don't think it was a large influence, because Tucker has slowly moved towards a more important critique than a libertarian critique. It's the power critique. And Tucker is known for his distrust for the ruling class. And that's what, I think that's really what pissed Rupert Murdoch off. I would think so. And I would understand, that makes perfect sense that it would, that he was willing to get rid of his cash cow for that reason is interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting to see what Tucker would do here. It's and I wonder, did Ron Paul really influence the Red Gang that much, or is it just because these wars have went so badly that they're now realizing this is a boondoggle and it's not helping us, and we're just throwing money away, which of course is the whole point, is to just, the whole point of these wars is just to line the pockets of defense contractors. There's no other point.
Well, I think there's one other point. Okay. So I probably agree with Tucker on this. So there is another point, though you're right. Lining the pockets of, Raytheon and McDonnell Douglas and these other companies. I'm still using terms that are maybe quite old. I've been around a long time, and so sometimes I remember the players in 1980s, not the players now. So.
Yeah, Raytheon. Yeah.
There's a lot of them.
Kellogg, Brown Root, or Boeing, or Lockheed Martin, or all these all the usual suspects.
And it is worth noting that many of those companies have produced voting machines and electoral systems. And Tucker is allegedly in trouble. The official story is that his part in the Dominion scandal and lawsuit helped unseat him. I think that's obviously not true, since Tucker was never pushed the Dominion's voting machine scandal at all. He challenged, I don't remember the lady's name, the Trump attorney. He challenged her many times, and he didn't believe that she was telling the truth because she never produced any evidence to him, and he wanted to see evidence. And, whatever else we may say about Tucker, evidence did matter to him. He may not be perfect on evidence, and I think that's obviously true. We all have sketchy on evidence sometimes, but he did want evidence, and he didn't go for the Fox line and the Trump line about Dominion and a number of other electoral fraud scandals without the evidence for it. I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just not, you suspect something, but it may not just be that easy to produce the evidence, and things can, yeah.
I agree. I think that the fact that we have electronic voting machines produced by the military-industrial complex is insane. I've known about it since 2000, when the debacle with Gore and Bush happened. And I was against them at that time. And I remember other people being against them, but nobody else. People will never talk about it, right? It's just a very odd thing that people see. They read a newspaper story that's quite disturbing about the lack of security regarding voting machines and systems of vote counting that are electronic, digital. And then they forget about it. And we shouldn't forget about some of these stories if they're key, and especially when they show how easy it would be to rig an election and not being able to find out whether it happened. And we do have to remember, now I'm not saying that it was the Dominion system or any other system that did the 2020 debacle. It was obviously something very deeply wrong with it. I looked at just the basic statistics of voting, and I concluded that there was something very odd about the whole election. It was the first time in American history that the number of voters in the election, the number of votes in the election exceeded the number of eligible voters in the previous election. See what I'm saying? Is that every election there's a number of eligible voters, and then there's the number of votes.
Yes.
And in 2020, there were more voters than there were eligible voters 4 years earlier, and that had never happened before. That was the one data study that I did about the whole thing. And
that could just be a matter of more people got out, but there are a lot of things. Yeah, there are a lot of things here that I've never been. I'm not in favor of electronic voting either. And getting back to all this is, who initially had pushed this electronic voting. Of course, it was not the blue gang that pushed this. It was the red gang and Bush, after claiming we had to, make voting fix vote, claiming that voting was broken because punch cards weren't working, and because some idiot would go in and vote for would hit the wrong hole, and then they'd not go back and then complain, oh, I meant to vote for Gore, but I ended up voting for Buchanan or something like that. My whole attitude is if you're that stupid, then that's what you deserve.
Except that
I look over my ballot 2 or 3 times before I submit it. I triple check it.
Yeah, most people don't do that. We should clarify to what extent is Bush red team. Bush was a neocon.
Yeah.
And he's part of his family is a deep state family. So he's certainly not a part of the same team of people who vote for Trump, right? It's a very different set of supporters. The Republican Party has changed its complexion a great deal since 2000.
Yeah, there's definitely, it's definitely, I think there's a lot of, it's very interesting how this is happening. And I don't know the shakeup, and I'm curious to know how much more it's going to be shaken up. I'm not really, I was not surprised that Obama was as bad on war as he turned out to be. I was surprised that his base did not turn on him. I thought Obama's presidency would go the way of LBJ's. That did not happen at all.
Right. And that's because race trumps war.
Yeah. I think if it had been Johnson in there, they would have turned on him, but they didn't turn on Obama because he was the hero. And I don't know.
Well, he was so cool. The extent to which human beings are driven by sex and their sexual standards is big, even in politics. And it's been very fun to watch the differences between the two tribes. And I think a lot of it is about sex. And it's a very funny subject.
Well,
because of course, libertarians, what does that make us? Because we're neither a real group. So do we have a sexual standard on this? Maybe we're just rational and that makes us the oddball.
Yeah.
And it's a very oddball thing.
Yeah. It was interesting just to see how much Rolling Stone magazine loved Obama, and they absolutely loved him. I think there was this, especially among that older generation who saw the 50s and 60s and saw how bad race relations were then. And they were kind of saying, wow, they're thinking back, wow, when I was a teenager, I never thought we'd have an African-American president, but we did. And I think a lot of people also voted for Obama, said, maybe if we elect an African-American president, we can finally move beyond all this. And instead it got worse.
Right.
And, America is still as racist as it was 100 years ago, even the fact that we just elected an African-American president. I don't know.
Well, I would say we're more racist than we were 50 years ago.
Well,
and that's pretty, you agree with that?
Did you say 50 or 15?
50. 50 years ago, but we're differently racist now because the whites in America are now split into two groups. Yeah. The whites who pretend to hate themselves and the whites who don't pretend to hate themselves. And that is an interesting difference. And the whites who pretend to hate themselves are largely women and they vote Democrat. And it's an interesting new complexion to the voting population. And their obsessions are interesting. I feel sorry for especially for African Americans, because they have been dumped on so many times, and they're dumped on worse by their putative friends, because there's no group that betrays a population more than white liberals, as they call them, and black voters. That's an amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Malcolm X made that observation in the 60s.
Sure.
He did not trust them at all. And there was always this attitude that I think it was always very patronizing. It's like this attitude of you can't help yourself, so we got to help you. It's.
Yeah. And that's a sad situation. And the fact that, half the black population or more, 90% of the black population sort of went along with it is very, very bad. It's bad for the country. It's bad for them. But anything that gets touched by statism is bad for the masses.
It's
But the Democrats, remember, the most important thing to know about Democrats is they're largely college graduates who think of themselves, if they do not even possess the jobs that wouldn't exist without the Democratic Party. So there's a lot of jobs out there, a lot of incomes that depend upon the Democratic Party and its policies. And so, of course, they support those policies. I mean, it supports them. They are the cognitive elite, and they think of themselves as the smart ones, and everybody else is stupid. And they and class hatred is the thing that strikes me as the most increased thing, and it's just the hatred of the cognitive elite for the masses, and of the masses for the cognitive elite.
Yeah, well, as Thomas Sowell would use the word, he called them the anointed, the self-anointed, and I love the word you use, is you would refer to them as prodigals, because I absolutely positively will never call these people liberals, because they're not liberals at all,
right?
And they never will be.
And I started out by just calling them illiberals because they were so illiberal, but then I realized the meaning of the word prodigal. Of course, I always knew it because I wasn't a dumbass, and I knew when I read the Bible, I knew the prodigal son wasn't the wayward son. He was the person who was overgenerous and gave away all his wealth to his friends, and then had to come begging to his benefactor, his father, again. That's the story. The prodigal son was prodigal in that he was overgenerous, that he threw away his money and was a spendthrift, and in a sense, he threw away somebody else's money, his father's money.
Yeah.
And the prodigals of our time are the people who lead with the idea of generosity. That's their idea, that we're being generous, but they're being generous with other people's money, and they're not really being generous, liberal in the old sense of being, just a big open and helpful to people. They don't really care about help.
And what's interesting too is, just like the prodigal son, a lot of them are, they were basically spoiled brats. They're, Ted Kennedy is the classic example, of just, they never actually knew what it was like to be poor, but for some reason, or Jay Rockefeller, they've never known what it's like to be poor, and they seem to have this fascination with poverty because it's something that they've never been close to, and so they want to pretend to care about it. And in a way of maybe I do think there's maybe a sense of guilt about, why was I born into all of this and so many other people weren't born into this?
Yeah, sure.
And but you'd never actually see them get down and actually work with these people. You'd never see them actually, go out on a ranch and, work as a hired hand and just actually work and actually spend time living or just doing a crappy job like these people. And if you actually do something like that, you'll have your perspective will be completely different.
There might be one exception. It might be Jimmy Carter and his charities post-presidency. He might be the last decent human being to be a president. His politics I thought were stupid, and there's not much to be said for him. And he was a pawn in a situation he didn't quite understand, and that shows a lot of strange stuff. But we're straying away from Tucker, aren't we?
Yeah, we have strayed away from Tucker. And to his credit, Jimmy. I mean, he's in hospice now, and he's probably not. I mean, to his credit, he's had an amazing ride since leaving the presidency, and the longest presidential retirement we've ever had. He's really lived a second life after being president.
Yes,
it's quite remarkable. I mean, I think most people, when Jimmy does go, I don't think you'll see very many negative things said about Jimmy when he goes.
It would be nice to return a little bit to the old camaraderie, if only for a moment, and if only under the illusion of that slice of history. Right.
But I also think it's a testament to just how bad things have gotten that we're now speaking so positively about Jimmy Carter.
Good point.
Getting back to Tucker, it is, one thing I do remember, though, at least in January and February, he was not really coming out against the corona nonsense. It wasn't until maybe that it got out of control, that he realized, we've got a problem. I mean, I asked, Jeff Tucker about this, and he said, yeah, he was in favor of this crap before he was against it, like a lot of the conservatives were.
Maybe we should do confession time, because in one sense, I was cowed by the situation.
Yeah.
And in that one sense, for instance, I remember early in the lockdown, the first 15-day lockdown, or even before then, when we were panicking about the contagion and didn't know what we were going to do, blah blah. I remember all these stories about local municipalities shutting down the beaches, ocean beaches.
Yeah.
And I remember saying that has to be the stupidest thing that's ever been. That they're not spreading anything at the beaches. That is insane. How could you believe it? I didn't write about it. And what was the reason I did? Well, I didn't have any studies. And this is where I think many of us who tend to be intellectuals, we'd like to have a study, right? We'd like to have that study to back us up. We don't want to just go on our gut and say this has to be the stupidest idea. Now, we know it to be the stupidest idea in human history. Shutting down beaches or parks is dumb in the face of a contagion like this, especially during sunlight. Sunlight is, as they say, the greatest infectant to a virus like this. So in that sense, I did shut up when I could have spoken out.
Yeah.
But after the 15th day of the lockdown, and I saw the governors keep the lockdowns, we knew at that precise moment, especially where I lived, that it was all political and something really creepy was going on. Right?
There was definitely something that was, it really was overwhelming, and it was, I will admit, it was hard to resist. And I certainly made a catalog of, I took screenshots of my Facebook posts, and I realized I pretty much was against it. But for a while I was, largely because it got to the point that I realized there's no point in talking about this. I have all these idiots who are just buying into this lock, stock, and barrel because the media was preaching it. And
right. The bombardment was huge. It
was huge. It was, and Tim, you've got to say, this was an absolutely, positively brilliant psyop. It was brilliant. I mean, it would make Goebbels proud. It would make all the master propagandists very proud. And if libertarians are going to complain about these tactics, instead of complaining about these tactics, they need to figure out how to use them.
Well, we should certainly know how to counteract them, and that would be a good idea. But we first have to point them out, and there's not a consensus even among libertarians about how it was done. And there are things that still need to be investigated as matters of fact.
Yeah.
The world governments, the governments around the world, and most of all of them had pandemic protocols in place. And lockdowns were no part of those pandemic protocols.
Yeah.
And they were all thrown out in the course of just a few weeks, right? And how was that done? Now, many people believe that's in alone evidence of a conspiracy. I don't know if that's the case, because certainly the Democrats, how they lommed onto him seemed to be a matter of opportunity to get rid of Trump. Is that they see that they could marshal the panic to do some interesting things in the population regarding how to vote, to increase the number of voters in a panic, and increasing the number of mail-in vote ballots is a great way of committing vote fraud.
Well, also just screwing and also just to screw around with the economy. I mean, the 2010s, that was arguably the greatest decade in world history. I mean, we saw amazing progress in poverty around the world, people being lifted out of poverty, all that, and this was completely destroyed. And one thing I realized when all of this happened is the misery always falls to the bottom. The misery on this is not even seen in America, because it's fallen on really poor people, the poor people in Peru, the poor people in Africa. And there's also this realization too that I do believe that most of the super rich do want to manipulate things to line their pockets, and almost none of them are capitalists at all. But it also dawned on me that these billionaires would rather steal from somebody who has a net worth of maybe $1 million or $2 million than steal from somebody who has $500 in the bank. Because there's more to steal. There's more to steal, from the top. There's a lot more money to steal in the top 10% than there is than there is in the bottom 10%. I don't think the billionaires want to steal from poor people because they're really not worth it.
Sure. I think that many of them would kind of like to see them dead, but that's part of, I think here we're sort of channeling Tucker Carlson's realization, his realization that major media is to bolster up the establishment, and the establishment is at the behest of the very, very rich and very powerful groups, not just the rich, but very powerful groups. And that's why they hated him, and they had every reason to hate him, because he was the most effective marshaller of ideas against them. Now, he was often wrong. He doesn't quite get free market principles, which is strange for somebody who called himself a libertarian conservative all those years.
Oh yeah.
But nevertheless, he did understand and came to understand what the job of the media is in a modern sense.
Yeah.
And even mentions who sort of ran it, the CIA and groups like that of the government.
Yeah.
That's one of the great things about the Trump years. I was never a real big Trump supporter. I mean, I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. I thought that the whole thing was kind of ridiculous. Yeah. However, it was ridiculous that showed a truth about our world that previous elections didn't show. And that truth about our world is that there is a major ideological conflict going on, and that the deep state exists. We can define it. We know who's in it. We don't know what they're doing, but we saw the tipping of the hand of what they will do to a president who threatens them. And Trump was a threat to them, partly out of style, but partly because he didn't believe, one of the things that you mentioned earlier is that he didn't believe in endless wars to make some people rich in America, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't his beliefs.
Well, I also think that because Trump, because Trump has owned hotels and casinos and stuff like that, he's probably more sympathetic to people who work in casinos and work in hotels. And those people are not, of the laptop class. They're people who, most of them, are living paycheck to paycheck. So maybe so Trump understands that his businesses depend on those people. So maybe because of the business he's in, he's a little more he was a little more sympathetic. I think Trump, for all of his faults, probably did care somewhat about the American people. I certainly don't think that was the case with Hillary. And Trump to borrow words from Matt Erickson, Trump flipped the chessboard, instead of playing by the rules. And in a way that was probably a positive thing, but I don't know what's going to come out of this.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Trump is going to get a second term.
No. And
I don't think he should have a second term.
No.
I mean, I kind of have a joke or a sort of a pat saying, and the pat saying is that Trump was the greatest president of my lifetime until he was the worst president of my lifetime. Last year was the worst presidency in American history that I can think of, almost. It was because I really think that the lockdown and the vaccine business is a great evil. I believe this is an attack upon American freedom to an extent that it still amazes me that libertarians at Cato can be so sanguine about lockdowns and mandatory vaccines.
Yeah.
That kind of thing just creeps me out. Like, it's hard to believe. It's hard to understand.
Yeah. I agree. And a lot of Trump's cultists, they forget this last year and just go back to the first 3 years. I don't know. And it was the most overblown, overhyped, I'm glad I was able to connect with some people who saw it for what it was, but it was hard to stay sane during all of this and just not completely break down and lose it. It was an absolutely, it was just a brilliant psyop. And I don't really know anybody who was really predicting. I think Gerald Celente might have predicted it, and I knew another guy.
What are we talking about? We're talking about the
predicted what was going to happen with COVID, because I think it was just, because what was all over the news media before then was Kobe Bryant getting killed, and the basketball player, and just it was so wild the way it happened. The one thing about Tucker is I can't remember him being wrong on very many things. The only thing I can really remember seeing him be wrong about was of course, playing into immigration paranoia, which seems to be something that now has become the main issue of conservatives now too, is to just be paranoid about immigrants and stir up as much fear of immigrants as they possibly can, which to me really isn't that all much different from COVID hysteria.
Well, I'm sympathetic to some of the immigration concerns, so I'm a little bit different on that. And mainly because, well, there's a number of reasons, and it's hard to get into. I consider the big issue with immigration is that we're not talking about free immigration versus controlled immigration. We're talking about controlled immigration and the reality of subsidized immigration. America subsidizes new immigrants, especially the illegal ones. They give them welfare checks. They give them all sorts of bennies that actually a new immigrant, illegal, coming into America gets more benefits than I do out of the healthcare system. I don't take any benefits from the healthcare system, right? I have to pay for it. They don't have to pay for it. And this element of it smacks of the Cloward-Piven strategy, right? That's the problem here, is that it smells like the Cloward-Piven strategy. And that is one of my fears about how the Democrats operate and how about all socialists will operate. Is the first you do is that you destabilize the system, and then you offer more government, right? The government causes the problem, and then the government is the solution.
Well, yeah. Well, again, this, the issue of, if you don't want the pigeons to shit on your house and your car, don't leave birdseed out for them. I mean, get mad at the programs. Don't get mad at the people who take them. Get mad at the programs, but here's my pushback.
Yeah. When libertarians address this, why do they never say this? I never hear the pro-immigration people like Cato, for instance, ever talking about, this is our solution. We can increase immigration. Just get rid of these programs. I never hear them say it. I never hear one libertarian for free immigration say that.
Maybe I'm missing that. Maybe it's because I say it so much I'm missing that. I certainly say get rid of the programs. And I do believe, in fact, I actually believe that this one reason is that conservatives don't make any effort to get rid of the welfare state, is because they can use it as an excuse for things like this. The conservatives would rather have the welfare state and a border wall than not have that than to have no border wall and no welfare state. They want the border wall, and the welfare state is their excuse.
But it should be looked at also. That's probably the Democrats too.
Yeah,
they don't want a border wall, and they want the welfare state. And the thing is that they know it causes problems.
Yeah.
But does Nancy Pelosi care about those problems?
I don't think so. But one thing I realized too, though, is Reagan was very popular with immigrants, and that's because he didn't hate them. I mean, it was when Pat Buchanan, runs in 92, and that whole virus starts to infect it. Now suddenly all these immigrants realize, the red gang hates us, so we'll go vote for a party that doesn't hate us.
Right. But then once again with Trump, Hispanics began voting for Trump in great numbers.
Yeah.
And the first time for a long time.
And I think that was
said he was for the wall.
Yeah, I think that was one big factor also in Trump's promotion of the coronavirus too, though, is I think he initially latched onto it as a way to demonize China.
What he didn't get, he's a deeply clueless man about government. He doesn't understand government, and that's a problem for him. We can agree on that, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And we didn't get is that our own government was funding the Wuhan lab.
Yeah.
And he couldn't conceive of the man that he put up on the television day in and day out. He couldn't conceive that man was responsible for the thing that they were fighting.
Oh yeah, I don't think there were a lot of things he could conceive. I mean, there isn't any way I mean, how can one president possibly know all the things that these agencies are doing? There's no way for him to know all that. There's too much
But
going on. He
should suspect. Shouldn't he suspect
I mean,
something?
this is why, as a president, this is why you need to go in there with moral principles, like, say, the non-aggression principle. Well, they're telling me they're telling me that the economy should be shut down. But then again, isn't that initiating force against people who haven't done anything? Aren't we initiating force against people? Aren't we violating people's rights? Gee, that's a fundamental understanding here, and that's why we can't do this. Yeah, I don't know what, lots of people have talked about that's so that's where we go with Tucker. One thing about Tucker, do you think I wonder if how Tucker's departure is similar to that of O'Keefe?
There's a number of parallels we could draw. Judge Knapp.
I wonder if they might form an alliance after this. That would certainly.
Well, he would actually have somebody who did some research.
Yeah, they could at least work together. I mean, if I was Tucker, what I'd do after this is I'd just take a year off. Just disappear, like Jordan Peterson did, and just take a year off, and maybe, I don't know what his situation is, but just take a year off, spend time with his kids or whatever his situation is. Just, he should have plenty of money.
Did you see his video from today?
No, I didn't see his video from today. Yeah.
It's a very interesting. Well, it's interesting and not interesting. It's just it's sort of a buck up America. He doesn't address any specific, and he does reiterate his main case against liars in media, which is interesting. But he was positive, and one thing about Tucker I didn't realize until very recently was how religious he was or is.
Yeah.
And he talks about God a lot now and evil a lot. And quite a few people who confronted the coronavirus pandemic scandal have now turned to religion again. Michael Rechtenwald, Naomi Wolf, even I forget the guy's name I forget his name. It was a psychologist associated, I think, with Harvard or one of those.
Jordan Peterson?
No. Jordan Peterson is weirdly religious. He's a very interesting and strange man.
Yeah, who's the psychologist you're talking about?
He's just somebody who's I've already forgotten. I shouldn't mention
Mark McDonald?
No. And I hate it when I have a brain glitch like this, so I shouldn't have mentioned him because I'm not going to remember his name until we get off the line, and then I'll remember it immediately. But there's a lot of people who think that confronting evil must mean that devils exist, and if devils exist, God exists.
Yeah.
Now that's a chain of reasoning I have some trouble accepting.
Yeah.
I'm willing to suggest that if there is mass panic and mob action and concerted government business collusion, that there might be a conspiracy involved at some level. That's not a problem for me. There's some conspiracy somewhere, and it's probably an opportunistic conspiracy, because when there's mass panic, then the conspirators say, oh, we can make something out of this. So it may not have been initiated by a government, a conspiracy, but I suspect the panic became driven by conspiracy pretty quick. And so that's an interesting question. I don't know who conspired when, what, but I can figure out why. And it's pretty easy to figure out why. Tucker's there, but he is going off on an interesting religious angle that I can't go on, because I remain where I was a long time ago, is that I just don't believe in God. And that's just where I'm at. I'm fascinated by religion. In fact, in the last year or so, I've spent more time thinking about religion than I have in the last 40 years. And it's a very interesting subject, but it's not how everybody else is thinking about it. I'm not thinking, well, for one thing, I'm researching Josephus Flavius and his books on the Middle East history and Jewish history. And that's a fascinating can of worms that I've opened and play with all the time now. So.
Yeah, that's very interesting, the whole religious angle. I think a lot of people, I think there's the realization that people are just looking for meaning in all of the madness that has happened, and they're trying to find something that looks like it's a safe port. It's interesting too. I forgot also, Tucker's father was Richard or Dick Carlson, and he was actually director of the United States Information Agency under Reagan for a while, and he was also on Voice of America. So Tucker was, at least his dad was fairly close to the establishment. There's
Tucker in a
picture of his father here with Gerald Ford, and that's certainly shaking
sure.
it. Yeah. So Tucker, but sometimes those people are the most interesting because they've grown up seeing how the establishment operates, and much like Gore Vidal in that sense. They know how corrupt it is, and they know how corrupt these people are.
But Carlson has recently confessed on another podcast that he didn't get it until very recently. He didn't get the function of the media, the news media. He didn't get that it was a lapdog or the fighting bulldogs for the deep state and the establishment. The war establishment. That's how he would look at it.
Well, the war establishment and also Big Pharma, yes.
Right. And he didn't get it, and he gets it now. And that's where he's the most red pilled, is just on that very subject. I think this goes deeper than he understands yet. He'll learn more. I'm pretty sure he's going to be learning a lot more.
Yeah,
he's not an idiot.
I'm still learning things, and maybe the most interesting thing for me, Tim, is, and I think this applies to you, is I think we are both, we will look at an idea and separate that idea and judge the idea based on, and at least try to judge the idea based on its own merits, separate from the person who preaches them. But I'm finding that more and more, most people out there reject or accept an idea because of the person who's attached to it.
Yes, the ad hominem fallacy is the most important epistemic rule for most people. And it's just a fallacious rule. It's not a good epistemic rule at all. But you can see why it's there, right? It's easy to see why it exists. So,
and I think that goes back to maybe reading Jefferson at a young age and being able to look at the good things he wrote, and just being able to say, well, there were some horrible mistakes made here, and being able to isolate those horrible mistakes. And certainly we've known various people. And I can still quote people and share articles from people that I don't like, because occasionally I said, well, here, this time he got it right. And a lot of people, the person's just a package deal. You either accept everything that person writes or you reject everything they write. And there's no, and to me, that's just plain silly.
Yes. It flies in the face of our strictures against the ad hominem fallacy, but it also, all the tribalism, and we are inevitably drawn to tribes. That's just human nature. And you and I belong to a very similar tribe. I mean, we have this, maybe the same tribe. We can call ourselves the same tribe, though we have different sub-tribes in it. Everyone's own history plays a part in how they think. But I'm interested that you read Jefferson at a young age, because I did too.
Well, Jefferson was one thing that was, that was easy to find at the library. I didn't have to go buy his books, and I knew who he was. And I read Thomas Paine as a teenager as well, so that was really where I got started. First time I really read serious, and also I actually read Machiavelli very early too.
Very interesting.
Which was I think I have a good political education because I never really had any one guru.
That helps.
And I think that's definitely something a lot of people in our movement have. For a long time, that one guru was Ayn Rand, and now the one guru appears to be Ron Paul.
Yeah. And I find that very odd. I like Ron Paul. He's a nice guy, and he's said important things all his life, and especially from 2008 on. But I've never really learned anything from him. I mean, he's always been. I can't really. There isn't really any. I think the most profound thing I read from Ron Paul was his pro-life case for the abortion pill. I found that to be very illuminating, but I can't think of any speech of his that really stands out for me or anything. And there's a lot of people I've heard speak and a lot of people I've read that were a lot more inspiring, but there's definitely a class of libertarians out there, many of whom were, I'd say, teenagers or early 20s when Ron Paul ran in 2008, who almost deify him. And I don't think it's healthy to deify anybody, because Right. Well, I come from the school of Nozick, and Nozick, when I read him as a teenager, and he didn't convince me. I was very interested in his ideas. It took me 3 years before I immersed myself into libertarian thought, and then it was an immersion among many writers, right? Lysander Spooner, David Friedman, Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises, who was probably the person who impressed me the most, and Hayek too. And I read a fair amount of history associated with these writers. And I didn't consider myself a libertarian until I was reading The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. And that I believe has to be the strangest conversion story to libertarianism there is, because it's not a book about libertarianism at all. It's a book about subjective value theory and our means of knowing. And it wasn't the epistemics involved in that book that impressed me. What impressed me was simply when I understood how subjective value worked in society, then I saw what liberty could do. Liberty solves a problem. It solves problems of conflicts. And that's where a number of things, it was at that point that all the things clicked. But of course, I first had to learn a few things. I had to learn how Social Security worked. I had to learn why the minimum wage doesn't do what people say it does, right? That's things like that. You can't really easily accept a libertarian ideology if you don't understand a few things about the world, right? There's a few things about the world that make it great, that without that understanding, you're just not going to be a libertarian, right?
Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. Who wrote that?
Ludwig von Mises.
Okay.
He wrote Theory and History, Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science, and Epistemological Problems of Economics. I was somewhat more studious than some people are when they get involved.
Mises is not easy. Human Action and Theory of Money and Credit are both very hard books to read.
I find Theory of Money and Credit to be hard to read, but I like Human Action. It's a brilliant book.
I think I do think Socialism is a good book. I think that
isn't that amazing? It really is amazing. And his theory of property has a theory of property in there that most people don't, and ownership that I think is not well understood even by libertarians.
Although I doubt I would hand Ludwig von Mises to people who are already converted, but I would never give them Ludwig von Mises trying to convert them. Well, Road to Serfdom, I think, is a very good book for the layperson.
Right.
I would also, I think, God of the Machine by Isabel Patterson is an absolutely wonderful book.
Do you like that book?
Oh, yes.
Okay, see, I've never been able to read it. I know this is awful that I can say this. I've never got into it. So you recommend it?
Yeah, I think I'm very historically minded. I always have been. I think I started even maybe at the age of 11 or 12, just trying to figure out what happened here. How did we get here? How are things so screwed up? So that naturally led to this. Of reading Thomas Paine, reading Thomas Jefferson, looking at American history and finding out these things that went wrong. And I do think it's better to read stuff by the people who were alive at the time than it is to read history books. Yes, if you could read the New York Times, and if you wanted to learn about World War I, I'd say go back and read if you can read all the New York Times articles about World War I or something like that. Read when they're writing at the time and getting a feel for what the people believed and what they thought was going to happen, because they didn't really know.
Right. Going to original first-hand sources is really important. Yes. And if you want to understand the American Revolution, surely you have to read Common Sense by Tom Paine and the Declaration of Independence. And if you want to understand the Constitution, and so that there's a lot of things to read there. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, for instance, in which Jefferson had a hand in, are absolutely essential. I think I read those in high school.
Notes on Virginia, also Jefferson's Notes on Virginia.
I found that boring.
It's kind of boring. It's kind of boring, but there's some good parts in it too.
Okay.
Reading some of that, and just also Crisis and Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. Yeah, I read all those things.
I've not read The Crisis, and I've not read The Age of Reason. Which is a sore spot in my education, though I think that I kind of understand what he was saying. That's one of the problems about many of these books, is that we think we know what they are because we hear about them so much, and we don't always get a good synopsis.
We don't. Some books I was kind of disappointed. I kind of found Rose Wilder Lane's Discovery of Freedom disappointing.
Okay. I've not. Have I read it? I don't remember if I read that one or not.
Yeah.
As always, I feel that my education is spotty, even if I've read a lot of stuff. So I've read pretty much all of Herbert Spencer. Most people don't.
Yeah.
And von Humboldt, who wrote an important book about basically the libertarian book written in the 18th century, and Volney's very odd book, The Ruins of Empires. What a strange book that is, but it was, I don't know if people are aware that The Ruins of Empires, or The Ruins, Meditations on the Empires, or something, the Rise and Fall of Empires, whatever it's called. Volney's The Ruins was the book that smart people were reading in the 19th century. If a major artist was, Walt Whitman, for instance, he would have read and knew it really well. A lot of people knew Volney's The Ruins, but most people now never have heard of it.
The Ruins of Empires, by Count Constantine Francis Volney.
Yes. And what was only recently discovered is that Thomas Jefferson translated the first half of it. Oh, my cat's coming in, so she's stepping on my piano.
Yeah. Jefferson did a lot of translations. It wasn't unusual in that time, though. For that's what's interesting. You look back at some of our statesmen like Jefferson and all these men. They were triple or quadruple or quintuple lingual. When's the last time America had a bilingual president? I don't know if there's been one in my lifetime.
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know. I mean, several of them pretended to know Spanish.
Yeah, that's one thing. You have ones that pretend to know it, but how many of them actually knew the language? I mean, how many? The class have the teleprompter, and they do. Yeah, they're all faking Spanish now. But I'm wondering,
Yeah. I don't know.
Or it might not necessarily be Spanish. It could be French, or it could be Italian, or it could be German, or it could be Chinese, or it could be any of these languages.
We should remember that before public education, our educations were better. So that's just one of the backgrounds to all this. Because after all, public education isn't for our elites. Public education is for the masses, but it infected our elites. And that's
if I have kids, when I have kids, if they ever show any language any interest in a second language, I will give them whatever they want and just say, here you go.
Well, marry a woman from a foreign land and have her speak. Have her teach you her language. So that would be as well as.
You can work together, and you can also, that's a lot of parents have told me that's their plan too. They're gonna make their kids bilingual or even trilingual. They're gonna do what they can to encourage that, and I think that's great. I think that's something because I think they realize it's not going to hurt you to have. There's certainly no harm in learning more languages. It's only a positive. It's but interesting. We're looking at where Fox News is. We're looking at where O'Keefe is now. I don't know if you had anything to say, also about Don Lemon, but that's probably nobody cares. That's out at CNN, but.
Well, I saw the final straw for Don Lemon when he defended. He was sort of became racistly offended by is it Vivek something? Was it what's the Indian man running for the presidency of the United States?
Oh, Vivek, yeah.
He has a last name whose name I have not yet committed to memory, but Vivek
Ramaswamy, I think that's it, or something like that. Yeah,
that sounds good. And Vivek was basically making a common sense point about racism in America and how the races have dealt with things. And Don Lemon's response was within the realm of expected elite opinion. And basically he made the black charge. If you're not black, he's telling an Indian man, if you're not black, you can't talk about this subject, was basically, as I could tell, that was his main message. And that's a really interesting gambit because there's no public information. We can't debate these things. I have my special information because I'm a half black person. Well, that's pretty lame.
Yeah. Well, I do think when you have life experience, it does make a difference. I mean,
Well, sure, but you could prescind.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that the other people can't have empathy for your experience or have at least similar experiences. Yeah,
Well, it's an interesting position that the Don Lemons of this world have, right? Is that we have they keep on, talking about white supremacy.
Yes.
And they're talking about how badly African Americans do in America. And as a group, African Americans do really poorly. That's true. If you look at the incomes, they're kind of on the bottom of the stack. But white Americans are only halfway up the stack, and then there's a whole bunch of other brown people above it. So it's obviously not white supremacy that shows who succeeds in America.
Oh, yeah.
And pretend that it is I think a gross, it's a psyop, and it's a trick. And people like Don Lemon should be, he already knows the arguments against his positions. He had good interviews with black people before he became ultra woke at CNN. And we have him on record with these interviews where calm African Americans explained to him why he was wrong. And that's an interesting thing to see him basically stick to the Democratic Party line on this, because this really is a Democratic Party line in which to keep the African Americans in the voting plantation. And it's just a voting plantation. It's not the real plantation, but it is a voting plantation. And they're obviously ill-served by this. And that's another thing that Tucker was good about, is that he saw through that kind of psyop. It's obviously a white supremacy is a dumb idea. Not because it never existed, but because it doesn't exist now in the way we think we know it exists.
Yeah. And it's almost become this catchphrase now for anything that's just evil. It's a meaningless term anymore.
Right.
Yeah. So
except that I do wonder if maybe progressivism isn't white supremacy, because the way that white progressives use the concept of white supremacy seems like, and the self-defeating message that they imprint and they want to imprint upon the minds of their darker skinned fellows seems to me a way of keeping them down. And they need them as voters who are always pathetic. That's what makes America the way it is today, is they need pathetic black people. And I would rather see non-pathetic black people. There are plenty of them around. They can get out of the trap, but they won't get out of the trap as long as they believe the bullshit. And the bullshit comes from
a lot of there's a lot of things that you need. It's like, you're a government agency that is there to solve a problem, but if you solve the problem, then there's no point for the government agency to exist anymore. It's definitely, it's all become a racket. I don't know if it'll ever stop being a racket, but anyway, let's, Tim, let's get back onto, where, as libertarians, you certainly have an interesting origin story. You were there at Liberty Magazine. How were things there in the early days of the magazine, when the magazine got started in 1987? Who was mostly there? It was Raymond William Bradford. It was you, and who else was that?
Kathy Bradford.
Stephen Cox was still involved, and of course,
Stephen Cox is still involved. Yeah, Stephen Cox was a big deal, but by fax. That's how he and Bill Bradford were often communicated, by telephone and fax. And they did a lot of editorial work, I did everything to start with. Then but then I couldn't do it all by myself, so we hired more people. I was initially assistant editor, I guess. Then I went to assistant publisher, then executive editor. And for the last issue, I think he put me down as office manager, just as a way to stick it to me, because I was leaving. There is one similarity between me and Tucker Carlson, and that's after we were both part of a media group, big in their own ponds. Tucker was part of the biggest pond imaginable, and I was in the smallest pond imaginable.
Yeah.
But when I left, my employer turned on me in meetings with his board members.
Kathy was there too. I mean, Kathy, really was the one who did a lot of the office type work. I mean, she went to the post office, she wrote the paychecks. I mean, she got the mail, and she did a lot of that stuff. It was so there was work done there too. I mean,
but we started having interns very early on, and we started hiring employees in 1993, especially. Jesse Walker came on, then a whole bunch of other people came on in various waves, but there was always conflict because Bradford didn't like to pay people very much, so there was a problem with that. And
he couldn't. He paid them he couldn't pay them very much.
Yes and no. The magazine, if you didn't count what he should have got as a employer, I mean, if you didn't count any profit, you didn't. It made a profit. I mean, it didn't lose money, and that's probably something that most people who make little things like this, little magazines like this, they don't realize that a little magazine like that could make money, and it could have made money, and it could have made more money if he'd tried harder. But he got what he wanted in his first year. That's the thing you have to remember about Liberty Magazine, is the Liberty Magazine was a project of Bill Bradford, R.W. Bradford, Raymond William Bradford, and he wanted to have about 3,000 subscribers and to discuss libertarian things with libertarians.
Yeah.
And he wanted to have a literate magazine for that crowd that didn't fixate on one clique within the movement. There would be no libertarian paradigm that was dominant other than his own, if he could get away with it, which was hard because he was, like me, a Misesian kind of person, and neither of us were anarcho-capitalists as such, and neither of us were Randians. None of the major factions of the libertarian movement really appealed to us very much, and our idea was just to, I shared this vision with him, is that we wanted just people to get better at making good arguments and entertaining stories.
Tim, in a lot of ways, that's what I'm trying to do here since I started this show. I mean, I'm not going to get involved in the sectarian wars, but the only thing I am going to avoid is I'm not going to bring on people here who just want to call names, which unfortunately seems to be a much larger contingent of the liberty movement.
Well, are you talking about what people do on Twitter?
Yeah. If they do that on Facebook or wherever, if you just want to call, if you want to come on, I mean, I want people who are sincerely interested in ideas, and I think what also bothers me now too is there's so many times people are making assumptions, like you'll see two people start to debate abortion, and because somebody takes a position on abortion, one person will comment and say, well, you must think this about guns too, and it's like, well, why would my position on abortion have anything to do with my position on guns? Really, they're two separate issues. But you'll see that, and that's another thing that really is, I think, becoming a problem. But
and a lot of the course, once again, people are trying to define their group. They're trying to find their group and define their group,
or they're trying to define other groups. I mean, you're one of the, I don't know. Bill. I certainly heard Bill call himself an objectivist many times when I was in the halls of the magazine, though. I think I might put him in that, but he was probably more of a disillusioned objectivist because he saw how much of a clown show the movement was.
But he also
you don't fit into any box, and Jesse Walker certainly doesn't fit into a box either. I mean, Jesse, you and Jesse are two of the most colorful libertarians out there. I mean, we need more libertarians like you guys who don't really fit into a box.
Well, I've tried to think for myself, and I think that I've succeeded to the extent I've succeeded. That's all we can say there. Jesse, like Brian Doherty, Jesse, they have a completely different history than me too. We're talking about, like, neither of them, I don't think. Well, maybe Brian Doherty was deeply influenced by Ayn Rand, but Jesse wasn't. Jesse was like me, no Rand influence detectable.
Yeah.
But they were both fascinated by paranoid conspiracy theories, which they regarded as jokes, and they like the Robert Anton Wilsons of the world. In fact, I think Robert Anton Wilson is an influence on Jesse and Brian Doherty that is there in the libertarian movement, but you don't see it pop up very often. Maybe now more than 10 years ago, though, because this is a world of conspiracy theories, and now is the time for more Robert Anton Wilson kind of narratives.
I honestly can't remember the last time I talked to any libertarian who read Robert Anton Wilson. It's
well, I was never a big fan.
Yeah.
I like the
haven't read
first,
him, unfortunately, but yeah,
I like the
I read
first
some articles by him.
sentence of his big book, The Illuminati, that you do with Shea, Harold Shea. What was his first? Not Harold Shea.
Robert Shea.
Robert Shea. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The first sentence is great, but I've never read the book. When it came to libertarian fiction, and that's where we're sort of devolving into, I was an F. Paul Wilson fan, and F. Paul Wilson is now recovering from a stroke, and his career is probably over. And he had a pretty good career for many years as a horror writer, but his early libertarian books are very interesting, good science fiction.
And Robert Anton Wilson was certainly. It seemed like to me maybe the liberty movement was a little more colorful back then than it used to be. I don't know if we're.
That's an interesting question, because I didn't. I approached libertarians in 1980, and that was in Portland, Oregon, and I entered the headquarters of the Libertarian Party of Oregon, and that's what it was. It was a rented flat in North Portland, and there was an equal number of women and men. This is the first thing you have to say about it, is that we often talk about how there's too many men and not enough women in the movement. Well, that wasn't a problem back in 1980. So that's interesting.
You mean in 1980 it was about 50-50?
Yes.
I've heard that it was pretty even also back in the days of the Nathaniel Branden Institute.
Yes, women were a big fan of Ayn Rand, because she was, we might say, if you want the ultimate empowerment for a woman, Ayn Rand was for the empowerment of women, and she advised how you do it, which was to be an individual. It wasn't to be a feminist, it was to be an individual. You became an individual, and then and you thought for yourself. You didn't accept tyranny. You didn't. Rationality was one of your key insights. Those are something anyone can adopt. You don't have to be any sex or gender to be a rational individual.
What happened, Tim? Where did the women go? What do you think happened there?
Well, I think what happened, and this is unfortunate, but I think it's probably true, is that we draw people to a set of ideas from the general culture, right? And Ayn Rand was gone by the Ayn Rand left the area, left the scene in the 80s, and the pool of women who might become libertarians had become acclimated in the 80s and 90s to welfare. They were not acclimated in the 1960s. The welfare state was just beginning in its biggest and most robust sense, other than in Social Security sense. But the handouts to women and children, which was really a big thing in the 1960s, it became in with LBJ.
Yeah, and also no-fault divorce.
And the divorce laws, but mainly I think the welfare state and how that affected women's views of the state. And by the time of the late 1980s, I think more and more women saw the state as daddy, the state as a husband, the state as a substitute for any relationship they could themselves achieve, because they could not imagine keeping a husband or a lover, especially in the environment that had been created by feminism and the welfare state. So things spiraled with the welfare state, and I think it sucked women into a dependent mindset in politics. And that is the real difference, is that women, that pool of women, they just got into their heads. And it's a very subtle thing. It's just what many things that happen to human beings in a political culture are at a level that's hard to pinpoint, and it's hard to disprove too. That's a problem with many theories.
Well, also,
Security did that as well. Social Security completely ruined American spirit.
Oh yeah. Yes. There's a lot of things it did. The other thing too is, when Nathaniel Branden showed up at the iOS seminar in 1996, he hadn't spoken to any audience of objectivists since the breakup in 1968. And I heard this from a person I definitely consider reliable. Nathaniel Branden showed up and said, "What happened to the women?" Yeah.
Well, I have my theory. It's just that I think
that's because by then I would say at that point it was 2/3 at that seminar. It was probably 2/3 male or something like that. There were not a lot of women there, And I think that's probably hurt the movements overall. I don't see how any movement can go far if it's skewed one way or the other.
Right. That's interesting. That's probably true. And yeah, what happened to the women? And I think that's, I mean, my theory, maybe it's the wrong theory, but
yeah,
the idea of the gendering of rationality in the case of objectivism, because that is the sort of the virtue of objectivism, as I understand it, and it's not a bad virtue as virtues go. Rationality is a good one, and then also of responsibility and liberty itself. The gendering of it, it's the very idea of responsibility. In fact, this is what I consider the key concept that doesn't get mentioned in libertarian talk ever, and that is what I call the division of responsibility. It's not true. It's never, but it's not.
Yeah. But, I would also add too, though, that Rand really viewed the family and motherhood as kind of irrelevant. I think that's her greatest weakness right there.
Yeah, it's nonsense. She herself couldn't imagine herself a mother, and this is a problem for all very smart women. Because I mean, it's also a problem. I never had children, and I chose not to have children, and chose not to get married. And part of this is because I decided that I couldn't imagine getting involved with people like that on a level of diapers and that kind of thing. And this is, I think it's a bad decision on my part. It was probably very bad for me, and I think it's bad for many people. It's bad for women. It's especially bad for women. And that's where feminism is such a perverse influence upon society. And Ayn Rand herself was also a big abortion proponent in her own way, and I think that's a bad thing too. Because I used to be unconcerned about abortion when, like in the 1990s, when you knew me the best, when you worked with me. I'm not that way. I'm not convinced that abortion we should treat it as just a thing to be tolerated. I think that it's a very bad thing.
Tim is awful. I've actually during the last 3 years changed my mind on abortion, and I never thought I would. And largely, and maybe this is a horrible perspective, but if Gretchen Whitmer, Jacinda Ardern, or Kamala Harris want to abort their kids, I do not want to get in their way at all. I'm going to say, go ahead and do it.
But they are babies,
and I know that's awful, but it's.
Well, I understand that, but that's just
politics is war, and if your opponents are going to kill their kids, it's awful. But I don't think outlawing abortion is going to get rid of it. And it seems like to me it's getting into this. It's also abortion laws also infringing upon some of these cases where you have possibly a miscarriage or possibly a problem or possibly just a complicated pregnancy. And sometimes hospitals are afraid to do things out of fear of repercussions of some of these laws.
Yeah, well, that's another question. I certainly am not interested in hounding people. But of course, we have rules about evidence and rules about accumulating evidence that should preclude some of this. Right?
Oh yeah, I agree. I completely understand, but also, people are.
I have to apologize for my cat. I don't know if you can see, but the cat was.
Even if you, I understand. Even if you go to trial, the jury finds you not guilty. You've still spent thousands of hours on a trial, or thousands of dollars on a trial, and probably hundreds of hours on a trial. People don't want to go to trial and get found guilty, and that still costs you there's still a huge cost of that.
Of course, there is.
People want to avoid that, which I totally understand.
But that's not quite pertinent to the whole abortion issue, is it?
But anyway.
Well, I look at abortion in a number of different ways. One of them, of course, is that I do regard it as out of my jurisdiction.
Yeah, I also see abortion as just more evidence of a culture that's completely and totally sick.
Yes.
It's a sick
But it's
culture,
also,
and
it's really a
the
big,
culture, it's a sick culture in so many ways, and also a sick culture where I think what we have 1/4 of women now are on some kind of psychoactive drugs. I mean, women in America are very, very unhappy, or at least a lot of them are.
yes, but so are the men, and this
Yeah,
is something we've done to. This is something both sexes have done to each other,
yeah,
and they didn't quite realize what they're getting into when they started. And
yeah.
this has been
Well,
going on for a long time. Men are on psychoactive, various, suppressants, and
yeah.
I don't SSRIs or whatever they're called. I was
SSRI,
on
Zoloft, or whatever you want to call it.
yeah,
Yeah,
I was on
I
Wellbutrin.
don't think men. I think the white knights did it, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of things done here, but I didn't want to go down this rabbit hole anyway. So
Yeah, well, I'm not equipped probably to talk
yeah.
about it.
But getting back to what happened at Liberty, Murray Rothbard was involved at the beginning, and how involved was Rothbard, and what happened with Rothbard?
Well, Rothbard was enthusiastic about having a journal of libertarian ideas in which the journal kept on going.
Yeah,
There's been a lot of libertarian journals that were spotty and temporary and badly run, and some of them were run. And he used to make fun of Justin Romano, who became his biographer and so forth, for getting involved with attempts that were ridiculous, and that's okay, because trying to figure out how to do something in the world right is hard. Bradford turned out to be a multimillionaire. He didn't tell people how much he had, but he had a lot.
yeah,
He made a lot of money at the end of the 70s, and then he sort of semi-retired. And after he took care of his mother, and she died, then he wanted to start a magazine, and he'd been wanting to do a magazine for a long time. And he waited until desktop publishing became a viable program instead of applications on computers.
yeah.
And so that's how that started. You asked a question, I forgot where we're going. I'm sorry.
Yeah. What happened with Rothbard? I mean, Rothbard was there for
Rothbard,
a while. Yeah,
right?
that's true though. Liberty Magazine came out at a point really where desktop publishing was becoming viable, and where you could print the magazine on your. I mean, you couldn't have done it 10 years earlier because everybody's still using typewriters.
Right. And I mean, there was expensive typesetting equipment.
Yeah.
But that's expensive, and getting
Yeah.
experts to work it was expensive.
Yeah.
However, desktop publishing, Bradford and I, bought our Macintoshes on one day and got a program called Ready, Set, Go.
Yes.
Within one day, we had done a newsletter.
Yeah.
Okay. The ramp up time was, I mean, of course, we were very rudimentary in our skills, but we got it out. And that's how the magazine started. Rothbard was excited. He got on board. He was a big part of the promotion for the initial magazine. Bradford wrote the copy. I wrote the envelope. It was a very successful pitch. Rothbard was enthusiast for the magazine for about 2 or 3 or 4 years. I forget how long it was. Then he devised his paleo-libertarian strategy. Bradford did not go on board with the paleo-libertarian strategy. I wrote an intellectual attack upon it called The Libertarian as Authoritarian. And within one issue, Lou Rockwell left in a huff. And an issue later, Rothbard was out.
Lou Rockwell was involved?
What? Lou Rockwell was Bradford talked to Rockwell all the time in the early days. And Rockwell was making a pitch for Bradford to become the lead, Liberty to become the leading paleo-libertarian magazine in the world, that kind of thing. That was the kind he was doing. And he was not succeeding because Bradford was not interested in paleo-libertarianism. He was not impressed with Hans Hermann Hoppe's argument, as neither was I, which was a big part of what they were doing. But also the whole paleo-libertarian strategy didn't impress us as likely to succeed.
Yeah.
And that's a big issue. It was not. It was a very. I mean, if you look at what I wrote at the time, that pretty much says everything that I believed then, and I believe most of those things today. I don't really disagree with what I wrote in 1991. Was that what it was? I forget what year it was that the big break happened, but it was a big break. And Rothbard never turned on us in public. He just quit. Rockwell was really, really anti-Liberty, the magazine, for a long time. And then after a while, we just forgot. I mean, I I like what Rockwell has done since then. I have no beef with Rockwell. Others may. I don't care about the beefs with Rockwell. And over time, I was more of a Cato guy. I think you mentioned this on Twitter the other day that you lean towards Cato over Mises Institute in those days.
Yeah, in those days, yeah, definitely, because Liberty had pretty friendly relations with Cato, but
Yeah.
when Rothbard died, there were all kinds of wonderful tributes written in Liberty magazine to Rothbard.
Well, we didn't hate Rothbard.
Yeah.
We had mixed feelings about some of his contributions. I thought he wrote one terrific essay, just that really was important to me, not because it was perfect. In fact, I disagree with it now, but it helped me understand marginal utility, and that was Toward a Reconstruction of Utility and Welfare Economics. And he was very clear when he wrote. Rothbard was a good writer, and he deserves to be understood as a good writer first, and then as a thinker and a thinker and scholar, and then as an activist. As an activist, I was never as big of a fan of his tax. I thought paleo-libertarian strategy was kind of goofy. I thought his previous move to the left was kind of goofy. He wanted liberty quickly. Okay, this is probably where every libertarian falls, and this is probably where I disagree with most libertarians. When it comes to liberty, I understand the case for liberty and why liberty would be better, but I also understand how far we are from it.
Yeah.
And the idea that we're going to see it in our lifetime, that is like a 0.01% of a chance. And I think it's almost not possible. And libertarians who tell themselves that it is possible, I think, are deluding themselves. Liberty is in its infancy.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of libertarians just figure, if I'm never going to see it happen, why should I fight for it? If it's something that's going to happen 100 years after I'm dead, maybe there's this feeling of not caring. I'm not that. The paleo libertarian strategy seemed to be more just to focus on, keeping on, like not putting, say, not putting, prostitutes at front and center or something like that is what basically. I think Rothbard was just trying to find different alliances and trying to build alliances that might work and go forward. And he never found those alliances, unfortunately.
Right. And, there's something to be said for not running prostitutes in your political party. I will grant them that, though I have nothing personally against it. Not because I like prostitutes, but because I am a kind of a libertarian at heart, and I don't mind if somebody I disagree with promotes the ideas I agree with. I don't hate it. And the fact that it turns off many people is worth thinking about. However, we do have to explain to the right as well as to the left the logic of liberty. And the logic of liberty says that you have to accept people you don't agree with as independent persons. And the case for liberty, we all have to be. This is actually Rodney King. We can all get along, but we have to all get along by not being busybodies in each other's lives. That remains true. And if you don't accept that, you aren't really a libertarian, and you're not advocating liberty, and you're not going to be a major source for liberty. And the paleo-libertarian strategy fell for that reason, is that the paleo mindset, that is the conservative, social conservative mindset, is not primarily a libertarian mindset. It's primarily a traditional approach mindset. There's great things. I love traditions, and that's fine, but it's not going to get you liberty. You have to have something more.
Yes. Yeah. There's definitely, and I think but it doesn't mean you have to celebrate the people. There's a difference between toleration and celebration, and the left seems to think you either have, if you don't celebrate something, you hate it, which is ridiculous.
Well, the left is obsessed with hatred. That's the first thing. And that's silly. It's childish. In fact, the left is obsessed with childish things. That's obviously true. And I don't celebrate prostitutes, but I really don't celebrate people who pretend to change their sexes. Excuse me. But I think people should be free. But children aren't adults, so I have an issue there. And I also don't think that trans people have a cause to change our language behaviors or our judgments about them. And so there's a whole bunch of issues that are now paleo that I'm now seeing paleo libertarian, because I'm on the side of normal people who reject a lot of the nonsense that leftists want to push on us. And it is absolute nonsense. You can't change your sex.
Yeah. You know something else that's interesting that's been happening too, Tim, and this is why libertarians need to drop the term classical liberal. I'm now hearing I've now heard some people call people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. a classical liberal, or the classical liberal is now being stretched to apply to, say, like somebody like JFK or FDR, but not the woke left.
Yes. The first thing you have to remember is that most people are very ignorant. And
most people what?
Are very ignorant. This is the biggest insight we have into politics is that these are most Americans are taught by public schools, and they know almost nothing, and especially about politics. They are ignorant beyond belief. So you have, I mean, I've said it when I was young, classically liberal, like FDR, and I've heard that all my life because I didn't know, they didn't know. I didn't know that liberal actually applied to the American tradition before 1870. And I mean, there's a lot of ignorance in this world, and that's where that comes from. And when somebody says that, they're just being stupid. We can't help it, and that's okay. But classical liberal is a problem as a term. It's two words, and one of them has too many syllables.
Yes,
we'll have the same number of syllables. Anyway, liberal.
Well, it's a problem because when you call yourself classical, you're basically saying, well, we used to be popular, but we aren't popular anymore.
But that's true.
Yeah, but it's not. But it's very bad market. It's bad marketing. I mean, the only time that calling yourself classic worked was Classic Coke in 1985. I mean,
right, and it was, and boy, did the Coca-Cola company unsling their assessments they really blew it, and they in fact, that's kind of what we're seeing now. Is that are we seeing that? Are we going to see that in the world of media with Tucker Carlson being booted out? Are we going to see a classic Tucker Carlson at some point? I don't know. I don't think so. I think he's going to become independent. I kind of hope he becomes independent and sets up his own empire, or loms onto an empire like Rumble and so forth.
Yeah,
I know how I'd advise him.
Tucker could go his own way. Yeah, a lot of these people can just go out and build their own media companies. I mean, he's got enough money. He could. I don't know where Tucker lives. He could put a studio in his house and get his own.
He's beyond that. He's beyond that.
And get his own connection.
Does he still own the Daily Caller, or does he not own the Daily Caller anymore?
I don't know if he. I don't know what his relationship with the Daily Caller is. I'm kind of surprised too that I would also think that Tucker's probably gotten some invites to come on. I mean, I would certainly invite Tucker on if I was Tim Pool or somebody like that. Just say, hey, Tucker, you want to come hang out with us a little bit? Yeah, it was founded by Daily Call. Tucker founded it, and Neil Patel. So I don't know how Carlson left the site. Patel bought him out. So
Patel. Okay,
yeah. So he's not involved with Daily Caller anymore. Yeah.
Okay. Well, he's done it before. He could do it again, and he could make a big deal now. He's very popular. If he joined, I mean, I would think that it makes more sense for him to join like 3 or 4 other very prominent on-air talents, and form their own channel, and from there ply the trade. I don't think he should be part of the Daily Wire. That a lot of people are suggesting this, and I think that would be a disaster for him, but very good for the Daily Wire.
I think he could just do something on his own too. He could just do like put up his own channel, be like Lex Friedman or something like that.
Sure.
I mean, people are going to listen to Tucker.
He could go way beyond that. I think his potential is way beyond that level.
Yeah.
I think that he could. Yeah. I mean, I think that has potential far beyond Joe Rogan. I think he has far beyond Tim Pool, though Tim Pool is quite successful and surprisingly successful, and that's quite nice in its own little way, because that somebody so humble of a mind as Tim Pool could become a success is really, it's an inspiring.
Tim Pool never comes off as being a know-it-all, which I think is good. I think he seems like he's always willing to learn. I don't know, maybe it's his hat. That's kind of become his trademark now. Put the hat on. It's
well, he's also bald, right? So
that's one thing that's changed too. I mean, could you imagine somebody like Cronkite or Edward R. Murrow ever going on air wearing that? I mean, Tim Pool just goes on and I think he wears whatever he wants. He's you've taken the suits out of TV journalism now. It's the other thing too that I think a lot of these podcasters have done is they've now we're now back to the era where people are making shows for TV and for radio, which is something they did in the 50s, but for a long time, they made it very visual, and now it's back to kind of being both, because most people don't listen to both. But I wonder, I wonder too, though, what were some of your arguments against paleo-libertarianism when you mentioned that? I mean, the libertarian is authoritarian. I do remember reading that, but it was a while ago.
Quite a while, like 30 years ago or more, right?
Yeah.
It's an astounding thing how much time has passed by, and I barely remember the arguments. The main point is, and my main objection was that Rockwell was focusing on a certain set of virtues and vices.
Yeah.
And I thought that he should focus on all of them, or none of them, because he would talk about, he had a list of the virtues that he wanted to promote, which he considered traditional paleo Christian, that kind of thing. And I said, well, these are virtues, yeah, but they're the virtues that one might find promoted by an authoritarian society. But why not other virtues too? And I suggested a number of virtues, and that's my takeaway from all this, is that I think people need to. I could be helpful if libertarians thought in terms of the virtues and vices and understood them, how they actually worked in ancient philosophy, of Aristotle, for instance.
Yeah.
But in a way that Ayn Rand didn't take. Ayn Rand mentioned almost none of those virtues or vices. She was not a virtues ethician. I can't say the word. Virtues ethician. I think that we should revive the idea of virtues and vices, but then understand that liberty isn't about those virtues and vices, except maybe one, justice. And it's a very limited affair, and it's a very limiting thing. It's about limits, the limits that we place upon our actions, so that we can all get along and it solves problems. And I don't like the people who get involved with cultures that obsess about only one small part of society. That's a little bit of a problem.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I definitely, I definitely remember, yeah, it's very interesting to look back, though. It's because, I do have to wonder, I've seen some of the things out from Jeff Tucker. It seems as though the Beltway wing of libertarianism has tried to give in a little bit to try to make themselves look professional to the establishment. And I think we can safely say is that they've had absolutely no influence on the establishment, and they've just discredited themselves. Is that correct or not?
Well, that's the way I judge it. Like you, I judge it that way. Now, I could be wrong, and not everybody's the same, and everybody has their own compromises. And we do have to make compromises with existing reality, right? And so, what is our relationship going to be with the state as it exists now?
Well, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. Yes.
So it's a problem. I mean, it's a problem. Libertarians always deal with that problem, but it's. I found Cato's repeated attempts to square libertarianism with lockdowns and mandatory vaccines to be repellent, and I don't consult Cato anymore. To me, they're dead to me. I mean, the whole organization, they can go wherever they want to go. I want nothing to do with them. And of course, I turned on Cato only like 6-7 years ago when I learned something weird about Cato, and it's the weirdest little story ever.
What did you learn about him?
That they fired Dom Armentano because Dom Armentano signed the petition and came out for transparency on UFOs. They fired him for wanting transparency on UFOs, and David Boas flippantly said, well, that was just one obsession too far, ha ha ha, or whatever he said. And I understand his position, but it's cowardice. It's complete cowardice. And at that moment, that's actually the moment I realized, that's how deeply into our minds the establishment is. Okay, we are run by
because Armentano wanted to investigate spaceships,
or whatever they are.
Or I don't because UFO is just unidentified flying object, which could be anything. But basically, is the question is whether or not we have visitors. And Dominic Armentano. Yeah, it's funny how you. Well, there was some good. well, even back in the 90s, there were still some good people at Cato. I mean, well, and I think there's still a few good people at Cato, but there don't seem to be very many left anymore.
Well, they just got rid of Ted Galen Carpenter.
Yeah, they just got rid of Ted Galen Carpenter. I mean, I can remember back then when Sheldon Richmond was still at Cato. He's always been solid. In fact, I put out an invite to said, hey, Sheldon, maybe I'll just come on. Said, I've known you almost 30 years and I've never really seen you wrong about anything. So I figured that's a good record.
Well, he's very much a left libertarian and I'm not, but
really,
he said point blank to me, he's a left libertarian. But here's the point.
Yeah,
but
I never really thought of him as being a left libertarian. But
no, he probably isn't. I mean, we probably had a weird little discussion. But the thing is, he wrote a book on Palestine. I bought it as soon as he wrote it, as soon as it came out, and I've never read it. I don't even know where it is in my library. And that's I feel bad about it because the Israel-Palestine problem is one that I've never properly addressed in modern times. I wouldn't say that any of my opinions are of any value whatsoever because I just haven't really researched it properly. But he wrote a book about it, and I'm very curious, and that's what the subject you guys should talk about. He's
still I think the best person on that subject.
Yeah, but I'm interested in what Flavius Josephus said about the Palestinian problem.
I'm also realizing that sometimes if you get into this stuff, you're already kind of distracting from the issue. And the only issue to me is I don't want us to see us giving foreign aid to Israel. And I don't really care who's right or wrong in that. And you can get stuck in that quagmire. And it seems to me as both, there are very rare situations where there is one clear good guy and one clear bad guy.
Well, this is an interesting thought experiment regarding immigration. There's no free immigration from Palestine to independent Palestine to Israel, but there are Palestinians and Arabs in Israel that have even full voting rights. How many Jews are in Palestine that have full voting rights? I wonder how many of those are.
I know what you're saying, but I also hear that a lot of Christians leave Palestine because they just don't want to get caught up in it. They hate it because.
The whole Middle East is a real problem, and I thought more about Syria than I've thought about Israel, since Syria is a fascinating case. For the last 10, 15 years, we've been barraged with the case from the neocons and the neolibs to conquer Syria to get rid of Assad. Assad is a minority sect Muslim.
Yeah.
And that minority sect runs Syria. When they're gone from power, you know what's going to happen in Syria? The Sunnis will kill the Shia. And the Sunnis will kill the Christians. And the Sunnis will kill the Jews. That's what's going to happen in Syria. And Hillary Clinton doesn't care. The people who want to overthrow Assad don't care about those people. But right now, the only thing standing in the way of genocide in Syria is the continued rulership of Assad. Whatever else you want to say about it, and it's awful. But
I don't go down the rabbit hole very much, but because I don't know. It just seems like a bunch of none of these people are libertarians, and none of them really want to have a libertarian society. They just want to. It's just people who are all full of hate who want to. And I'd rather see them turn all that hate on themselves than direct it to us. Let the dogs fight. I'd rather let the dogs attack each other than the dogs attacking me.
Well, one way to do that is to not seek the destruction of the Assad rule.
It's
awful to say because I don't. Would I like Assad if I met him? I don't know. Is he?
I don't think any Muslim country is capable of ever being civilized in any due time.
Doesn't look like it, but we could be wrong. If the United States got out of the business of ruling over and deciding Muslim,
possibly yes, but
we don't know. You're right, we don't.
And this is another area too. I think where Lou Rockwell and the Mises Institute has raised their profile is the first thing that happened, that changed the landscape was the World Trade Center, and they were all out against everything that the establishment was doing, and Cato and Reason, and they were quietly against. I think they were generally against it as well. But then you occasionally see this article like, Kathy Young, for example, in her absolutely ridiculous article.
I don't know what she wrote.
Reason. Well, it was some people refer to it as the No Libertarians and Foxholes article, or
okay.
It terrorized. I find it horrifying that people are sending secret messages. She was coming out in favor of surveillance and stuff like this. It was
sure. Well, I mean, Kathy Young. I don't follow her. I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, she's now involved with the Bulwark, by the way.
I don't know what the Bulwark is.
The Bulwark is one of Bill Kristol's projects.
Okay, that's sad. But
and Robert Trosinski has been involved with it too.
Robert Trosinski is somebody I've interviewed. I liked Trosinski, but I disagree with him on a lot of things. He's very prone to the elitist argument, the for the elites argument.
Yeah.
And I'm not. The elites rule this world on taxpayer money and with an elaborate scheme to enrich themselves at the expense of the masses. I'm not for the elites. I mean, I find that to be absurd, and to hate populism because you consider yourself an intellectual elite, smarter than average.
Yes.
And yes, Trosinski is very smart. Well, frankly, I probably am smarter than average, but I don't really empathize with the elites. I don't sympathize with anything they do because I consider them to be deeply corrupt. And and politically, I would rather vote for Trump than I would to vote for any candidate that is approved of by the elites. I don't want to vote for Trump, and I don't resist it.
It's not, if it's a libertarian society, it's not supposed to be ruled by elites. It's supposed to be individuals rule their own lives.
Yes,
that's what they don't. This whole is it Shikadalmia or?
Oh yes,
in her unpopulous newsletter. I mean, So basically, I want to. And some of them really aren't for liberty. They just want to change who's in the driver's seat. And so they criticize these.
The problem with Ms. Dalmia, as far as I can tell, and Brzezinski and many of the others, is they don't understand how the world works. They don't believe the deep state exists. I'm pretty sure that we get both of them to think that it's a bad term for something that doesn't exist.
Yes,
they think that what we're dealing with regarding American foreign policy is a policy issue. It's not a policy issue. This is a deeply rooted set of institutions that work in a certain set of ways against our interests and very dangerous for the world. And they don't understand that. And because they don't understand that, everything they say about elites and populism is nonsense. Because they think they're on the side of good policy for the government we have. And I'm against the government we have. That's it.
Well, there's definitely this attitude among them that somehow that there can be good government if they just that there are good that the concept of having elites run things isn't bad. We just need to make sure we're the elites, and and libertarianism rejects the whole concept that elites will be in charge. It's and I do think there's still this unhinged paranoia about Donald Trump that I don't know. I've never seen this kind of unhinged paranoia about a president in our lifetime. It was kind of crazy on the right with Obama, but it wasn't anything like what I've seen toward Trump.
Right. Well, I agree with you, but I mean, sometimes I sympathize with why they believe what they believe and hate what they hate.
Yeah.
He's not a man he doesn't seem like a virtuous man to me.
Yeah.
But he has his virtues, and I don't appreciate the way Trump thinks about politics. and he thinks that his hunches can rule the world. He doesn't have to do any research. Well, that's wrong. And libertarians have had this same attitude, and that's wrong. However, Trump found himself opposing policies and activities of the state that the elites lust for and they support with all their might, and that includes the continuing war footing of the deep state, and that shocks them, and that's I don't know what to say about that. I'm on his side on that issue, though he was so bad on it in some ways. I mean, he kept on caving. He put anybody who hires John Bolton, is just an idiot. I mean that's not right, but it's so silly.
It was almost and of course he gave into big pharma, so it's really hard to figure out. It's sometimes I think he was sincere, and sometimes, maybe that's part of the game. Is it's really hard to know what Trump is, whether he's controlled opposition, whether he's sincere or whatever. He's that's the thing. He's so unpredictable.
Well, and that is a reason to oppose him.
Yeah,
I oppose him chiefly because he didn't understand what he was up against with the pandemic, and that's because
because it was the overhyped craziness over that, which is
he put Fauci on daily television. That there's no excuse for that.
Yeah, well, Trump, like I said, I think he promoted the coronavirus to demonize China, and he should. And I do wonder what Hillary would have done with that. Whether she would have just ignored it or whether she would have tried to take it and make it into something to destroy the country too. It's hard to say. I don't know. A part of me thinks that this could be the closest we are to, and certainly I don't think America is ever going to recover from this because I don't think America can possibly recover now anyway. And I'm kind of at the point of saying, just do whatever puts the country out of its misery first. Yeah,
that's a bracing comment.
Back in the 90s, I thought America could be salvaged, but after the World Trade Center, I don't think there's any hope. After the World Trade Center, and more importantly, the idiotic reaction to the World Trade Center.
Yes. Well, have you heard what came out of the Guantanamo case? There was a court case in the Guantanamo Bay. Have you heard about the information that came out about the 9/11 hijackers?
No, I haven't heard about that.
Okay, well, we should look this. We should look up that and research that because it looks like that some of them were FBI.
Wouldn't shock me. One thing I do want to. Yeah.
What was going on there? Something was strange about that whole thing. It's not.
Yeah.
Comprehended.
One thing I do want to get back to is I'm really concerned about the state of our movement, though, and that's another reason why I started this. Is what do you think was the reason for so many selling out on COVID? And I mean, it wasn't this bad. It wasn't this bad in September 2001. It was. I mean, a few people sold out in September 2001, but it was nothing. And to me, September 2001 was a lot more excusable. That was at least a real event that killed 3,000 people. This was making a mountain out of a molehill,
and making a mountain of graves out of what could have been just a few graves. Because the way they reacted, we now know, I think pretty certainly, that by suppressing normal medical responses to a pandemic and pushing for the eventual salvation by pseudo-vaccine, that killed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in America and around the world. And that was a major problem. So the people who like at Cato caved to the PSYOP or whatever it was, the mass mania.
Yeah, Cato and a lot of people at Reason. I mean, most of the people that you'd call Beltway libertarians caved in some degree here or there. Yeah, and I knew lots of other people who caved, and I'm just wondering, how did this happen? What happened to our movement?
Well, I'm going to just reiterate something I thought when I was at Liberty, is that our Liberty movement is young.
Yeah.
We think because we're old, we think it's mature. That's not true.
Yeah.
We're young and we are learning. And we haven't explored a number of areas of life that are challenges to the way some people think in the libertarian movement. Pandemics, this is an issue that was never talked about very much in the libertarian movement back in the 1990s, of what to do in the case of a epidemic. David Friedman would bring it up, and he had interesting ideas, but we didn't talk about it at length, right? So we're not prepared for that. And then there's things like, you're chuckling.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's an interesting thing. We were just unprepared, and we're unprepared for trans. I think people.
Yeah, it was certainly not the kind of I don't think there were many in the liberty movement who predicted that the corrupt establishment would try something like this.
Right, but they should, because we have to remember that the establishment is what establishments are.
Yeah,
and they're not out for our benefit. They're out for theirs, and that should be. But elementary class theory, from the old industrialism group in France in the 1810s and 1820s and 30s, Augustine theory and all that crowd. From that we know a lot, and we know how governments are, and that was the original class analysis that libertarians still have to apply even to this day. And now it's more complicated, because never before in human history have we had as complex a economic class system as we have now. And libertarians are just in a strange position. We have to learn a lot.
Yeah, because some people said really that Cato's caving in on this really didn't surprise them that much too. I mean, Tim, the other thing too, though, is it seems like I think because the movement is still kind of young, you do see some people, I think, that you thought were solid also going into other areas that you wouldn't expect them to. I mean, you talked, back out, when I was out in Port Townsend, I remember you talked about Lou Rollins, and we've talked about some other people who were libertarians who kind of went over into crazy spaces. And what do you think is the deal with that? I'm watching that happen now too.
Well,
is it just because they get pissed off at somebody and they decide to go someplace else? I mean,
well, people have many issues to deal with, and people get triggered in certain ways, and they sort of just like a flash in the pan. And L.A. Rollins, I mean, Roy Childs explained L.A. Rollins to me, and he knew L.A. Rollins really well from the Nathaniel Brandon movement. Have you heard this? Have you heard this story?
Well, I haven't heard this story. Yeah, something with Nathaniel Brandon. Yes, this.
Yeah, okay.
And Lou Rollins still alive?
No, Mr. Rollins died quite a number of years ago.
Okay, so all these people are dead, so they can't sue us. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Well, I liked Lou, but I stayed kind of a little bit distance from him, because I was not interested in his Holocaust revisionism.
Yes.
And became one of his major things, and he became kind of an anti-Semite. Now, L.A. Rollins was basically a Native American, or Native American.
Yes, a Native American who became a Holocaust revisionist. Yes, let's wrap our head. Was he a white supremacist? Yes,
Well, that's a good question. Yes. He was not really interested in that so much, but
they'd probably call him a white supremacist, though.
Yes, but he definitely didn't like Jews. And now, what to say about all that? Well, I asked Roy Childs once, because Roy Childs was a very large man who was excellent on the phone, and I knew him only through phone conversations. And boy, was he magnificent to talk to.
I've only heard great things about Roy, and we lost him way too soon. And unfortunately, we lost him largely because he was so overweight.
Yes, and he had a vice that we all have our vices. I have a vice. I'm sure we all have vices, and he couldn't deal with that one. And that's the sad thing about human life, is that our vices are hard to deal with sometimes. Yeah. Now, he said what happened to L.A. Rollins is that Mr. Rollins attended a Nathaniel Brandon intensive course, and Nathaniel Brandon, in public, in front of everybody, laid bare the soul of L.A. Rollins for everybody to see. Just laid it out. And Rollins was a libertarian. He was a good writer, but Brandon laid it out. And then Childs said this point blank. He said, and he did nothing with it. He helped him solve no problems. All he did was lay out the soul of L.A. Rollins for everybody to see. And that this is not therapeutic. This is actually malpractice, is what Roy Childs said.
Yeah.
And the response that L.A. Rollins had was to seek something more radical and more divergent from American establishment opinion than libertarianism. And if you want to get something like that, then you have to start flirting with something bizarre like Nazism. Yeah. And so L.A. Rollins went that direction. I had very little interest in debating Mr. Rollins on the subject of the Holocaust because I knew little or nothing about it. I had no interest in dealing with that.
So they just go on, they just do this to shock people? Is that what you're saying? I mean,
well, one of all of our motives, why do we do the things we do? Well, one of the things we do is to find our place in the world. And one of the things we do is that some of us believe weird things, the awful thing of believing a weird thing. And do we do it because it's the truth or because we get our rocks off on it? Sometimes we do it just simply to get our rocks off on it. Or sometimes we get our rocks off on the thing that we think is the truth, and then it doesn't do enough for us. So Mr. Rollins had to go in some other direction. And many people have a problem, and this is a really deep problem. We're not going to get liberty in our lifetime.
Yeah.
So what do we do now? Every libertarian has to deal with the fact that liberty is a low likelihood success story.
Well, I think, one thing, I don't know how, I think it's cool that libertarians get involved with historical revisionism, but I don't know how it ever advanced. But because libertarianism sees the state as evil, I don't know how you could ever call it libertarian to promote a belief that a genocide was fake. To me, I mean, if I'm a libertarian, I'm going to say, yes, this genocide happened, and this proves to us all why the state is a bad thing. So why would I ever deny a genocide if I'm a libertarian?
Right. Well, I don't think L.A. Rollins was a libertarian.
Yeah.
He speak one. And in fact, his only book on the subject of libertarianism mocked one doctrine of libertarianism, the myth of natural rights. And I think that book was not very good, by the way.
Yeah.
I think that, but he's right in one sense, is that most libertarians don't understand what natural rights are. And it's because it's a difficult concept, and it comes from a paradigm that no longer exists. And so when libertarians talk, if they talk natural rights, they're kind of talking in a very antiquated way. And Rollins could mock that, and he showed it to be, he sort of gave the most reductio ad absurdum level of analysis you could possibly have. Now, I don't think he was correct in his analysis, but he was right to think that libertarians didn't quite get it, and that he could do something. Now, I went another direction, is that I took it upon myself to analyze what rights were and are and must be in every situation, and then to figure out what they are. When you realize what rights do and what their function is in society, then you start getting a handle on what kind of arguments we can make that might be persuasive to others.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting philosophical problem. Rollins went the wrong direction, I think.
Yeah, and that seems to be where I don't like talking about it, where a lot of people who were former libertarians end up going. Chris Cantwell, and there have unfortunately been others. I'm seeing some of them now. They're calling it post-libertarianism, and there was another thing that's interesting too, is a lot of them are actually going over to Christian Orthodox.
Yes.
Which I don't know that much about, but they find it to be very powerful. In fact, I think people are often just looking for answers and looking for a way and looking for something that gives them some kind of inner peace. And
yes, and you're not going to find it in libertarianism. Libertarianism isn't about inner peace. Libertarianism is a proposed solution for outer peace. And if we want inner peace, we're going to have to each deal with that in our own way, and we're all going to come up with different answers, and that's just fine.
Well, it seems like to me our movement is attracting more and more, is attracting less healthy people, and I don't know what to say about that.
Well, maybe there are less healthy people around, and maybe
that could be too. Yeah,
I mean that's
and
deeply messed up societies. We're in a decadent phase of society.
Yeah.
Excuse me again. I can barely talk anymore.
Yeah. Well, yeah, get water if you have to. Yeah, I mean, we've went a long time. Yeah, I know we're having a lot of damaged people, and I look at some people, like, say, somebody like Tony Robbins, or somebody who would be really successful in his life. It's like, why the heck would he ever want to get involved with this?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think part of it is that everybody yearns for something that's ego transcendent, that transcends their egoism. And what I'm saying is that liberty is that. This is a way for people who think of themselves primarily in some term as an eccentric or as an individual in some sense, not as a part of any tribe. The early adopters are often very odd people. And then later you get on, different tribes come into the liberty movement. But the liberty transcends your self-interest. This is where I disagree with Ayn Rand completely. I don't consider liberty a direct self-interest. It's not about self-interest. It's about other interests in a union of interests in an interesting way, right? It was and that being said, we're going to get all kinds, and I'm not even bugged by the fact that.
Well, maybe libertarians should take as their task getting along with each other. Because, we're going to have to, if we did achieve liberty, we would still have to get along with each other, and we would be all very different. Remember that libertarianism accommodates a great diversity. Liberty accommodates diversity. That's one of the great myths of our time, is that to have diversity, you must have a maximum state. That's actually the wrong end of the stick, right? The right end of the stick is to realize if you want diversity, you have to have liberty. And libertarians have to recognize that among their own kind. We're going to have different approaches. We're going to have many different philosophies coming together for a limited purpose, which is to advocate liberty. That's something Ayn Rand didn't approve of, but Ayn Rand was wrong, and that's one of the reasons I've never been a Randian, is that she's obviously wrong on this, is that you have to be able to accommodate radically different philosophies.
Yeah, I agree. Accommodating. Well, that's the whole point of liberty. If everybody agrees, there's no liberty. There isn't any reason for liberty. It's about disagreeing. So, Rand. Well, it's like, oh, we all have to agree with Ayn Rand, and
why?
I don't know. I have to admit, sometimes some of the Ron Paul people sound even crazier than the Ayn Rand people, which is not. There is one other thing too that because to their credit, at least I've never heard an objectivist, use the term Ayn Rand revolution. But how many times have I heard Ron Paul revolution? Is like, what revolution?
Well,
what revolution? How has society changed because of Ron Paul? What is anything different in this world because of Ron Paul? If there is, I don't know what it is. Okay, you changed your mind, but so what?
Well, that's a big deal to them. Everybody has their own love of the way they got into liberty. I guess that's one of the things we've learned, right? Is that everybody has their own they love the story. And Ron Paul is very important for a lot of people. It wasn't important for us because we precede Ron Paul. Now, I think that the reason for Ron Paul revolution is that somebody, and I forget who it is, mirrored love in revolution and made that a good poster. And that's the story of the Ron Paul revolution.
Yeah, so that's where we are. So
that's liberty today. We're not there yet, and the movement is not catching up to where we were yesterday.
Do you have anything else to say before we go?
Well, I think that one of the reasons we deal with Tucker Carlson today is we realize the great truth is that for many of us, our interface with the state is through the media. And that our real leaders are thought leaders. And some of us are breaking free of the old stranglehold the CIA, media has on Americans. And so when we find somebody who breaks from the mold, we're kind of interested in what he does, and we root for him, even if we don't agree with everything he says. He certainly isn't libertarian anymore, if he ever was, but he's somebody that libertarians just have to watch.
Well, certainly we're in an interesting place right now. Well, please like the video or give it a thumbs up. Subscribe, follow me on all the channels on Rumble, YouTube, and Odyssey. Please go buy my novel Escape from the Village. And I'm Chris Baker, and we are out.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, bye.